Good morning. I've missed you all so much. We are back with our no talking read aloud. And if you remember the last time we read, the students were figuring out how to go about their activities and how to deal at home without talking. And then we left off with the teachers were going to have a special meeting. And so that's where we'll start at chapter 15, which is called Control Center. So, you've been with our fifth graders all afternoon. You've seen and heard what they're doing. What do you think should be done? Mrs. Hyatt looked from face to face around the conference table. Mrs. Marlowe spoke right up. We should get them all in the auditorium tomorrow morning and lay down the law. Just stop it. It's silly and it's disruptive. I mean, it's interesting and all that. And with these kids, it's maybe even an improvement, but it's still not right. It was sort of cute right after lunch today, but then I had the second group and then the third during seventh period. And by then it was just a bother, a real distraction. We've got a lot of material to cover in science, so I say we should squash the whole thing right away. Mrs. Escobar nodded her agreement. It's very annoying in math class. These short answers they use, it's a game to them, and that's all they're paying attention to. I'm trying to work, and if they're playing a game, it's frustrating. Very frustrating. So if this is a vote, I say we stop it first thing tomorrow. Mr. Burton shook his head. But why? It's very inventive what they're doing, and it's creative, and they're all thinking. And I think it's mostly positive, too. They're all exercising some self-control, which is a big change for this group. I think that we should try to have a sense of humor about it. Just let it run its course. It can't go on for very long, can it? What's the harm? Well, it's not a problem in the gym, said Mrs. Henley. Actually makes it easier, me not having to yell and all. I've got no complaints. If they want to be like they were this afternoon, the whole rest of the year, it's perfectly fine by me. It's not fine by me. That was Mrs. Akers talking. I only get them for music 2 or 3 times a week, and I need to make every minute count. And I asked Jim Torrey, and he feels the same way about art class. I went along with it this afternoon, and we had some fun, too, but I can't afford to waste more class time. I can't teach them songs if they won't sing more than 3 words in a row. I just realized something, said Mrs. Overby. You know what that little rascal Dave Packer did yesterday? Instead of giving an oral report, he stood up at the front of the class and coughed for 2, maybe 3 whole minutes. And he was pretending. I'm sure of it, so he wouldn't have to talk. This really has to stop. Mr. Burton said, but don't you remember, we're talking about the unshushables. These kids have been driving the whole school nuts for years and years, and suddenly, like some amazing gift from elementary school heaven, they all stop talking, and what are we going to do? We're going to start them right up again? That doesn't make sense. Why not wait a little? See what happens, just for another day or so. What's the harm in that? Mr. Burton honestly didn't think it was a problem, but even if he had, he would have asked the other teachers to back off anyway. He was hoping the quiet time would go on long enough for him to gather more information for that paper he needed to write for his human development class. The principal had heard enough. She was glad to get everyone's opinion, but she didn't want the teachers turning against each other. This was her school, and like everything else, this decision was her responsibility. Mrs. Hyatt said, thank you for your thoughts, very helpful, but this is not a voting situation. And I've made my decision. You know I've been trying to get these kids to quiet down ever since they were in first grade. So it's tempting to go along with this activity of theirs and hope it will lead to an improvement. But I think that would be wrong. The sudden quiet might seem easier than all the noise, but neither behavior is really what we want. These children need to learn to be quiet when it's right to be quiet, and they need to talk and participate at the right times too. We don't want an all-or-nothing situation, which is what this is. What we need is real balance, real self-control. If we let them keep up this game or contest or whatever it is, I think we'll be sending the wrong message. So we need to have an assembly tomorrow. I've noticed that Lindsay Burgess and Dave Packer seem to be the ringleaders, and I think it's more like Dave and Lindsay are sort of team captains. They're keeping score, counting words, and it's the boys against girls. I intercepted a note. The principal raised her eyebrows. A note? You didn't tell me about that. Mrs. Marlowe shrugged. It was this afternoon in my classroom. Mrs. Hyatt said, it might have been helpful if you had told me about this sooner. The principal paused, letting everyone feel how displeased she was. And in that moment, Mr. Burton thought, woman, always keeping little secrets. But he immediately corrected that thought, because anybody who hangs on to stereotypes about girls and boys shouldn't, especially if he's a teacher. The principal said, "Anyway, that's good to know, and I think I see a way to approach the problem. So, at the start of homeroom, please bring all the students to the auditorium." It was quiet for a moment. Then Mr. Burton said, "What are you going to do if the kids don't respond to your approach?" Mr. Hyatt looked at him, a trace of frost in her eyes. "What do you mean?" "Well," he said, "I'm just saying that we've got 5 years of experience with this group. They've never obeyed very well when we've told them to stop being noisy. Why should it be any different when we tell them to stop being so quiet?" Mrs. Hyatt stared at Mr. Burton a moment, and in her mind a little voice said, "Leave it to a man to say something negative." But of course she immediately corrected herself, because that kind of thought can get a principal in trouble. On a school faculty, it's never supposed to be girls against boys. In fact, that's called discrimination, which is against the law. So Mrs. Hyatt looked around the table, smiled, and said, "All I can promise is that I'll do my best to resolve this situation in the most orderly way possible, and I know that each of you will do the same. See you all first thing in the morning." As the teachers left the conference room, there wasn't much talking. In fact, there was none. And now we're going to move on to Chapter 16, Orders. It was a bright November Wednesday, and the morning playground at Laketon Elementary School rang with the usual shouts and laughter of children. But there was another layer of schoolyard activity going on, if a person knew what to look for, because all around the swing sets in the jungle gym and the baseball diamonds, small groups formed up as fifth-grade friends passed notes and gestured and play-acted, trying to tell each other what had been happening since Tuesday after school, trying to tell each other all the clever ways they'd gotten along without talking. The fifth graders were so glad to see each other. They felt like they had spent Tuesday night in lonely prison cells, practically in solitary confinement. There was also some contest business being conducted. It was time for the first test of the overnight honor system. As agreed upon beforehand, boys who had spoken illegal words reported to Lindsay, and the girls reported to Dave. As Dave received the morning confessions from a short line of sheepish girls, he felt pretty good. He added 15 more points to the score against the girls. Lindsay felt good, too. By holding up fingers, 4 boys admitted that they'd spoken a total of 12 forbidden words, which seemed suspiciously low to her. But the rules were the rules, and she had to trust that the boys weren't lying. Just like Dave had to trust the girls. And Lindsay admitted to herself that there might be a few cheaters on both sides, so it probably evened out. Anyway, she wasn't worried, because she was pretty sure that the girls were still winning. When the first bell rang, everyone went inside. Dave was in Mr. Burton's homeroom. When the second bell rang, all the kids sat silently at their desks. The teacher said, "Please line up at the door. We're going to a special 5th grade assembly this morning. If anyone would like to guess what it's about, just speak up." No one did, but Mr. Burton could tell from the looks on their faces that most of them had a pretty good idea. He smiled and said, "But don't worry, who could be upset with such beautifully behaved children? Not me, that's for sure." After his group had filed into the auditorium and taken their seats, Dave turned and looked for Lindsay. She was sitting next to Kelly, and they were passing a note back and forth. She did not look concerned at all. Dave turned away quickly so she wouldn't notice him looking at her. If Lindsay wasn't worried, he wasn't going to worry either, even though this assembly had to be about their contest. It had to be, didn't it? There had never been a special assembly at Laketon Elementary School before, at least not that he could remember. And there had certainly never been an assembly that had begun in complete silence like this. Lost in his thoughts, Dave didn't notice Mrs. Hyatt walking onto the stage, and she said something too, but he missed it. Scott Vickers elbowed him in the ribs, and Dave snapped back to the present just in time to see the principal looking right at him. "Dave, I said I want you up here too." In a daze, he looked around quickly and saw that Lindsay was already walking down the far aisle, so Dave lurched to his feet, scooched past his classmates, and hurried down the aisle and up the 4 steps onto the stage. Mrs. Hyatt stood between them, and she said, "Now, as you know, students, we always begin an assembly with the Pledge of Allegiance. So, Lindsay, Dave, will you lead us in the pledge this morning? Everyone, please stand up." The whole 5th grade rose to their feet in silence. Dave glanced across at Lindsay, and she glanced at him, and the look they exchanged was clear. What should we do? Lindsay gave a tiny shrug, and then they each gave each other an even tinier nod. All of this happened in less than a second, and that's all it took for each to know that this was the right time for a temporary truce. Dave and Lindsay looked out across the faces of their friends, nodded, put their right hands over their hearts, and turned to face the flag. Signal sent, signal received. These kids hadn't talked for more than 18 hours. Every fifth grader took a deep breath, and if the pictures of Washington and Lincoln on either side of the stage had been painted with hands, they could have used those hands to cover their ears. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The kids spoke with one voice, almost shouting, incredibly loud, amazingly powerful, probably the most rousing Pledge of Allegiance ever heard in a public school during the entire history of the nation. The auditorium echoed, and it seemed to take a moment for the room to stop shaking. This is a picture of them shouting the Pledge of Allegiance. As Dave and Lindsay hurried back to their seats, Mrs. Hyatt, her ears still ringing, said, "Thank you. That was excellent. I have called this special fifth grade assembly so that every one of you gets the same message at the same time. As of right now," and here the principal paused and swept her eyes over the upturned faces in front of her, "the contest or game or whatever you'd like to call this sudden quietness or this 3 words in a row business you're all doing, as of right now, it's over. Ended. Stopped. It was interesting, and I hoped you learned something. And we all hope that you also enjoyed yourselves. But I have decided that it needs to stop. What you've been doing has made it very difficult to have normal, productive classroom activities. And of course, that is why we're all here, to learn as much as we can every day. So, is that clear?" The room was silent, and then a scattering of kids replied, "Yes, Mrs. Hyatt," the principal said. "Is what I'm saying clear to everyone?" This time, the whole group responded, "Yes, Mrs. Hyatt," but there was no sudden rush of whispering, no undercurrent of talking in the auditorium, no joking and laughing, none of the usual behavior that the Unshushables were famous for. And the group remained silent. And Mrs. Hart realized something. Yes, the kids had all responded to her, and just now they had all obediently said, "Yes, Mrs. Hyatt," but that was only 3 words. And now it was still completely silent in the auditorium. So, to really prove that they had actually agreed to behave normally, well, she would have to get them all to start talking normally. But the principal instantly decided that this did not feel like the right moment to push it. Better to let the teachers work it out with smaller groups, 1 class at a time. So she smiled at the 5th graders and said, "Thank you for listening so carefully, and now I hope you all have a wonderful day. Teachers, you may take your first period classes now." And Mrs. Hyatt watched the classes leave one by one. It was a very orderly exit. All the kids were behaving extremely well. But it didn't feel right. It was just too quiet. And this is the next chapter, Chapter 17, Alliances. As he walked toward his first period class, Dave felt relieved. He was glad Mrs. Hyatt had put an end to the contest. He was especially glad that he wouldn't have to actually mark a big L on Lindsay's forehead, or the reverse of that. Now he could just think about his schoolwork again, because he really was a pretty good student. That's why he was in the high math group. But as he went into the math room, he didn't talk to his friends, and they didn't talk to him, and none of the girls were talking either. No one was actually sure that the contest was over, and no one was taking chances, including Dave. The bell rang, and as everyone took their seats, it was still completely quiet. Mrs. Escobar got right down to business. "All right, students, we're still working on metric conversions, and let's see. Who's got an answer for the first homework problem?" Lindsay raised her hand, and when Mrs. Escobar nodded, she said, 312. Mrs. Escobar frowned. 312 what? Lindsay said, "Degrees Celsius." Mrs. Escobar looked at Lindsay. "You heard what the principal said a few minutes ago." Lindsay nodded. "About how this little game needs to stop?" Lindsay nodded again and then raised her hand. Mrs. Escobar nodded and Lindsay said, "But why?" "Why?" said the teacher. "Because it's no good for anyone. It slows down our classwork, like right now. We should be doing math, and instead we're talking about not talking." Lindsay said, "Math is numbers." "Yes," said Mrs. Escobar, "but we need to use words to talk about how we're using numbers. You know that. You all know that. So stop this right now." Lindsay stood up and pointed at the dry erase board. "May I?" Mrs. Escobar said, "Go ahead." Lindsay had her homework paper in one hand and a marker in the other. She read out the numbers for the first problem and then showed the 3 steps she used to get the correct answer. She turned to Mrs. Escobar, and when the teacher nodded, she said, "How's that?" Mrs. Escobar was starting to boil over. "I am not amused by this, Lindsay. I know what you're doing, and I will not stand for it. Now stop it." Lindsay stood at the board. She pointed at the problem. "Is it right?" Another 3 words. Dave knew that look on the teacher's face. It meant trouble, serious trouble, and not just for Lindsay. He held his breath, waiting for the explosion, but the very next moment Dave amazed himself. He raised his hand. Mrs. Escobar had to grit her teeth, but she managed to say, "Yes." Dave pointed at the solution on the board and said, "Mine is different." Without asking permission, Dave was on his feet. He grabbed the marker from Lindsay and scrawled his work onto the board. He had the same answer, but he had worked with fractions instead of decimals. Mrs. Escobar said, "How many of you did it the way that Dave did?" About half the hands went up. "And the way Lindsay solved it?" The other half went up. The teacher nodded. "That's good. Does everyone see why it can be done both ways?" Everyone nodded. "Okay, here's a tougher question. Kelly, which way was easier, Dave's way or Lindsay's way?" Kelly said, "Lindsay's." "Really?" asked the teacher. "How come?" "Fewer steps." And all around the room, Mrs. Escobar saw heads nodding, saw the special light that shows up on a kid's face when understanding happens. She smiled. "That's right. Decimals really do make things easier." Tyler raised his hand and said, "With a calculator," which got a laugh from the whole class. And as they laughed, Dave and Lindsay looked at each other for about half a second. Not quite a friendly look, but similar. Then Dave thought, this means the contest is still on, and he wasn't sure how he felt about that. The class sailed through the rest of the conversation problems, miles to kilometers, kilograms to ounces, acres to hectares, on, and every student responded using 3 words or less, or with written answers on the board. Mrs. Escobar knew the kids weren't obeying Mrs. Hyatt. She knew they were still counting words, still keeping silent unless called on. But honestly, at this moment, she didn't care. She was in the middle of an amazingly productive class period, and everyone was so focused, so alert, so engaged. Compared to the classroom experience she'd had with these same kids just 24 hours ago, well, it was like night and day. And she liked the day much better. And what was happening in the other first period classrooms on Wednesday, classrooms where Lindsay and Dave were not on hand to provide some leadership? As science class began, Mrs. Marlowe had already decided to make an example of the first kid who gave her a 3-word answer, and it happened to be Kyle. "I asked you to tell me about the order Lepidoptera." Kyle nodded. "Butterflies and moths," he repeated. "And that's all you know?" she said. He nodded again. "Pretty much," which got a giggle from the class. Mrs. Marlowe grabbed a notepad and picked up a pencil, reading out loud as she wrote, "Dear Mrs. Hyatt, Kyle has refused to obey your instructions. He is not participating in class discussion, and he—" Kyle raised his hand and Mrs. Marlowe snapped. "What?" "I'm participating." "No," she said. "You're deliberately using as few words as possible, and you are disobeying the principal." Kyle shook his head. "I'm conserving." She said, "That's nonsense. Conservation means—" Kyle finished the sentence, "not wasting." Mrs. Marlowe glared at him. "Conservation is for energy and water and soil and forest. Words don't need conserving." "Maybe they do," Kyle said, which was awfully brave of him. And all the kids in the class nodded their agreement with Kyle, which was also very brave. Mrs. Marlowe felt herself getting angry. However, she was an extremely logical person, and she had to admit that Kyle had a point. Anybody who had ever eaten lunch in the teacher's room or sat through a whole faculty meeting would have to agree that a lot of words get wasted every school day. And all that endless gabbing that made the unshushable so famous, 99% was waste. But she said, regardless of that, the principal said you must all participate normally in class. Kyle scrunched up his face. "What's normal?" Mrs. Marlowe said, "In this case, it means talking the way the principal wants you to, the way I want you to, the way everyone usually talks and answers, normally." Kyle said, "Can normal change?" "Well," and Mrs. Marlowe paused. She paused because just 3 days ago they had discussed climate change, and she had explained how a normal high temperature now would have been considered abnormal 100 years ago, and she knew Kyle would remember that. The whole class probably remembered. This was a very bright group. She continued, "Yes, you could say that, but it's certainly not normal to use only 3 words at a time, or no words at all, not at school." Kyle shrugged. "Works for me." Mrs. Marlowe thought back to all the times in this past week When she had to yell at Kyle about his nonstop whispering, about his constant joke telling, about his never-ending comments on anything and everything that ran through his twitchy little head, and she looked at Kyle sitting there quietly, giving her his full attention, and every other student was doing the same thing. And suddenly, the idea of trying to make these kids talk, actually demanding that they all go back to be noisy, self-absorbed chatterbrains, it simply wasn't logical. So Mrs. Marlowe decided to go ahead with her lesson for the day, and she adjusted herself to the new normal, because the new normal was at least 10 times better than the old normal. And that's where we're going to stop today. Have a great day!